Hello, my name is Wade Cook. I'm the Director of Church Relations for Hope Worldwide. But more importantly, I am, like many of you watching, a grateful disciple as I increasingly am aware of God's compassion and how much it has changed my life. It is a privilege to be a part of this great series called Jesus in the Poor. In session 1, Hans and Susan did a great job to introduce us to who are the poor and who are your people. In session 2, K-Sam gave us some really deep insights in what many theologians think is not actually a parable, but a story that Jesus tells about the rich man and Lazarus. It is my privilege to share session 3, compassion and turning that compassion into action. I am so excited to be talking about compassion today. Most people misinterpret compassion and in their heads insert sympathy or empathy. And those are very powerful and important emotions, but they don't have the same motivational force as compassion. As an example, if you're walking through a grocery store and you see a toddler about to fall out of a shopping cart, what do most people do? You move. You alert the parent, or you grab the kid, you do something. That's compassion. It's not sympathy that you are aware the kid's gonna hurt himself and you feel bad about that. It's not empathy if you yourself had fallen out of a shopping cart. It's compassion that moves you. That's what we're gonna be talking about today. And in the next few moments, as we talk about and rhythm as a group, I want you to be thinking about in what areas has God put you to express His compassion. Maybe it's a friendship, maybe it's at work, maybe it's a separate context in your neighborhood or some other place where you can think to myself, am I exhibiting sympathy, empathy, or compassion? That's what we'll be talking about today. As we begin our study today, I want to tell you a story that has fundamentally changed the way I look at compassion. It's about a couple of disciples in LA. This is last year, and this couple was walking to a grocery store when a gentleman approached them asking them for some food for himself and for his kids. As kids are a junior high and a senior high student who happen to be doing their homework just to the side of the grocery store. This couple so thoughtfully stopped, asked a few questions, and kind of got into this guy's story. And as it turns out, this man's wife had been deported back with their baby to their country of origin. He remained in this country with their 2 older kids to keep them in school. And in that process, though, they became homeless because of the change of deportation, had to travel, and the kids had been in 7 different schools throughout the semester. All of that time, while homeless, while living out of their car, both kids maintained a straight A average. Well, these disciples were understandably, right, impressed. And this sister happens to be the principal of an elementary school. She has a colleague and a friend who's an admission officer of a local college. So she set up a meeting with this high school teenager and her admission officer. And on the spot, that girl got a 4-year scholarship, full ride scholarship to a local college. Fast forward a year, that same girl is on the dean's list. She's still maintaining her scholarship. She's living with the daughter of these disciples, their roommates, and have a great little friendship, and her life is going in a completely different direction, in a positive way, of course. In addition to that, that boy and that girl, they work, in addition to school, to send money back to the mom and their baby sibling who's in the country that they came from. Now that's the difference between empathy, sympathy, and as I mentioned before, compassion. What would you have done if someone had come up to you at a grocery store and asked for food? I might have looked him in the eye and said, here's $1. I might have said, I'm sorry, I'm too busy. Or I might have thought cynically that this is just a scam and he's just using those kids. Who even knows if those are his kids? Instead, this couple stopped and had compassion and thought through what was the story. How could they get involved? That's the essence of what we want to talk about today, moving ourselves from compassion to action. Mark chapter 6 is a great story that gives us some context, and as Jesus is in every way the example of how we ought to live and react. Starting in verse 30 of Mark chapter 6, the apostles gathered around Jesus and reported to him all they had done and taught. Then, because so many people were coming and going that they did not even have a chance to eat, he said to them, "Come with me by yourselves to a quiet place and let's get some rest." So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. This parallel passage in Matthew tells us that when Jesus saw the large crowds, he had compassion and began healing their sick. Which is it? Well, I think it's both. That surrounded with the needs, Jesus didn't pull himself back or wave the "I'm off duty" card. His heart was moved to say, "Bring them to me," and healed and taught, to give all that he had, meeting both the spiritual and the physical needs. So I think the essence and what has tripped me up, what I've come to recognize, is that I misinterpreted compassion for empathy or sympathy. Let me give you an example. If you're in a grocery store and you see a toddler who's temporarily lost the sight of their parent and is stood up and about to fall out or jump out of a shopping cart, what do? Well, most normal people rush to the support and the aid of the kid, right? If that's not what you were thinking, that is what you should do. And they may get attention of the parent, but they, first of all, meet the need of the kid. Now, if they had just had sympathy on the kid, they would be aware that that kid's really going to hurt himself, and they'd feel bad about it. If they just had empathy, maybe they would recall a time they had fallen out of a shopping cart or had gotten hurt and would go, "Oh man, I totally get it." Compassion moves them to act, to do with what is in their realm of being, to catch the kid, to grab the kid, to stabilize the kid, to do whatever's necessary to keep this kid safe. That's the difference. And I want to ask you, as we stop here, do you have sympathy for the poor and the needy? Do you have empathy for the poor and the needy? Or do you have compassion for the poor and the needy? When we read in the scriptures, many of us are aware that the English word that we translate compassion is in the original Greek, splanchnizomai. That's what it is, splanchnizomai. What does that mean? It means a feeling deep in the gut. It's not just a heart compassion, but it's a gut change. Like if you were walking and you saw that toddler falling out, there's something in you that moves you to action. That is what Jesus modeled. Not just an awareness, but an action. Now, of course, we can't fix every problem and every change, and I'm not suggesting that we do. What I'm suggesting is that God has put you in situations, maybe with a friend, maybe with a neighbor, maybe with a coworker, maybe just with someone who will come up to you at a grocery store, and has put you in a situation where you can express compassion, where you can make a real difference in that person's life. How do we turn that, moving our heart, to compassion? Well, I think for some it's a three-step process. The first is that we have to move from our head down to our heart, down to our splanchnizomai, the guts. For many of us, we start in the head. The disciples show us this when Jesus says, "Look at all these 4,000 or 5,000 that we know of those two stories." When he feeds the 4,000 and 5,000, he says to the disciples, ask them a question, actually a challenge. You give them something to eat. The disciples immediately start thinking of the calculus. Oh, wait a minute. We don't have enough money. I don't make enough money all year to feed this crowd. What do you mean we do something? And if we just stayed in our heads, The math doesn't add up. The needs against what I have to offer are always way more. The math doesn't add up. And if we just stay in our heads, we'll never do anything. Jesus is the great equalizer. What we have times Jesus meets the needs. So the math does not work on our own, but with Jesus in the equation, it always works. So knowing that the equation will work, we can move then from our heads to our hearts, to be aware, to see the people. In that passage of both, where Jesus feeds the 4,000 and the 5,000, the disciples ask him, how are we going to do this? Jesus asks, what do you have? What assets are in the group right now? What small resources do you have? That's the second fundamental property of sustainably changing a community, is what assets are in that community? What assets are in that person? God has, in his infinite wisdom, given every community, as he has every individual, strengths. He's given us dignity. He's given us skills that are exemplary. Together, any community, any group of people can meet the needs of that community. Sometimes they need outside help or aid, and that's important in, say, the time of a disaster. But on an ongoing basis, to enrich and empower a community, there are assets that need to be identified and brought to bear. Jesus does that in asking that question to the disciples, what do you have here? Of course, their answer is, well, we have just a couple of fish and a few loaves. And Jesus says, all right, let's stop with that. Let's start with that. And of course, you know the story that they fed all of those multitudes. In feeding the 5,000, they were left over with 12 basketfuls. I think one for each disciple, for each apostle, that they could hold in their hands the leftovers of what Jesus had miraculously done. But Jesus modeled beyond just a heart and a caring, taking it from our head to our heart, to our guts, to do something about it. Now, how do we do that effectively? Let's talk about a few practicals that can help us turn our compassion into effective service. Practical number one, what are the needs of a community before you engage it? Some of us have the hero complex, that I see something or I don't even look into the community, but I just dive right in and bring an energy and an enthusiasm, but you might not actually be meeting the needs of that community. I saw this firsthand for myself when I went to Haiti one year. And when we walked into a small community, I was evaluating what I thought this community needs. And this group of older men came up to me and introduced themselves as the elders of that community. That was a really fruitful conversation because those gentlemen know that community, live in that community, and were able to direct my energies and resources much more effectively. So number one, what are the needs of the community? Do some investigation before you instigate something. Number two, figure out what your passions are. What gets you going? What is on your heart? What sorts of things do you lose time thinking about? Or if you see a magazine article about it, you'll pick it up and be interested in that article. What things get you going and that you like to do? What are your passions? For me, human justice and human justice issues, questions of equity, and whether they be civil rights or gender rights, it's important to me, it's a value to me that we act in the ways of Micah 6, as God calls us to love justice and practice sharing and giving of our resources. That's important to me personally. So, point number two, passion number two, what is your passion? Practical number three, are there community partners or folks in those communities already doing the work that you want to do? We do not have to reinvent the wheel in most places. There are some well-meaning, very educated, thoughtful groups and communities and organizations doing some wonderful work in this country and around the world. So before you engage in a community, you have first determined what are the needs, and then check around to see who may already be doing some work that you can come alongside with, that you can partner with, that you can learn from, and hopefully bring some talent or some energy into to enhance the effectiveness of that work. So practical number 3, are there community partners that you can join already doing the work? If not, you may have to decide, all right, if there is a need that's going unmet, do I want to meet that need? Don't just pop in and pop out. Does this need require a program or just a sustainable event? That's a thoughtful and careful decision that you want to make with a lot of advice. Because we don't want to just pop into a community to do something. That program or that event needs to be sustainable. That it needs to be empowering. It needs to create and protect the dignity of those folks that you're serving. So if there's not a community partner that's already doing something or not a need being met, consider, am I the one, and what would be the need, what would be the event or the program that would meet this need? Number 5, engineer then a program if you decide to do something that is sustainable, that makes sense, that isn't just resource basis and resources being brought into a community, but that looks to and adds the assets that are already in that community. We do not want to be people, and many good nonprofits and well-meaning people come into a community and they unintentionally do harm by divesting of that community the resources. For example, if someone has in the community ability to fix bicycles, then you don't want to bring a mechanic in. You want to empower that person to create a little bicycle shop within the community. And then that resource and that asset stays in the community and empowers the people in that community. There's a whole lesson and training around sustainable programming, but I just throw it out here as a practical to consider. If you do take the step to design a program or an event, be sure that it's sustainable, that it has wisdom behind it before you launch into it. And finally, get a team, collaborate, do it with people. None of us is an effective island. We need friends and other people to partner with us to do something, collaborate. And in that sense, a team will go a lot further. You know the old biological fact that if one goose, if one goose flies by himself or herself, they can fly up to 200-300 miles by themselves. But if they fly in a flock, they can go up to 1,500 miles. Sharing the load, encouraging each other, empowering and energizing each other. Whatever you want to do, however way you want to express your passion, to make it effective, it's going to take a team. So consider these practicals as we've talked about moving our compassion into action. It's got to move first from head to heart, to that splagnitzomai, our guts, that we act. And secondly, we need to do it effectively, strategically. And finally, I want to say thank you. Thank you for what you're already doing. I know that I'm talking to an audience who does and cares about the people and the communities that you're in. Thank you for the things you've done, maybe known only to God. Thank you for the things that you're dreaming about doing. Thank you for allowing yourself to be used by God to make this place a better earth and planet for our fellow sojourners. What you do is important. Who you are is important. And to God's glory, let us turn our compassion into action.